June 4th, 1942, 9:00 a.m. Berlin. The morning air inside the operations wing of the Reich Chancellery is cool, conditioned by heavy stone and the quiet hum of bureaucracy. Outside, the Third Reich is preparing for its second summer of total war, but inside these soundproofed walls, Adolf Hitler is receiving routine military briefings compiled overnight from across Europe. The atmosphere is not one of panic, but of aggressive anticipation. The massive maps dominating the room focus almost exclusively on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht is massing millions of men and machines for Case Blue, the offensive intended to finally strangle the Soviet Union. To the men in this room, the war is a terrestrial equation to be solved on the steppes of Russia. However, tucked into the bottom of the intelligence pile, relayed through a web of German naval attaches and intercepted radio signals, sits a short, unassuming summary from the other side of the world. It concerns a Japanese operation near a remote atoll called Midway, thousands of miles northwest of Hawaii. The report states simply that the Imperial Japanese Navy has engaged American carrier forces at this hour. For the German High Command, this news is initially received as a footnote, a minor tactical update from a distant ally. The information is incomplete, cautious, and deliberately restrained. It describes contact and uncertainty, but it does not yet describe victory or defeat. For months, German leadership had accepted Japanese naval dominance as a fixed, immutable condition of the war. The shock of the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had crystallized this belief into dogma. In the eyes of Berlin, the Japanese were the Prussians of the East, disciplined, martial, and technically superior, while the Americans were viewed through a lens of ideological arrogance. German intelligence assessments in early 1942 assumed that Japan controlled the Pacific Initiative completely and that American carrier strength had been shattered, leaving the U.S. Navy paralyzed and defensive. That assumption had become the bedrock of Germany's strategic calculations. Hitler and his advisors operated under the firm belief that the United States would remain hopelessly overstretched, paralyzed by the need to defend two oceans, and far too slow to concentrate its industrial might against fortress Europe. When the first reports from Midway arrive that morning, they are read without a flicker of alarm. The language is technical, dry, and filtered through Japanese diplomatic channels that prioritize face-saving over factual clarity. Aircraft losses are mentioned, but without totals. Carrier movements are described, but without confirmation of damage. The battle is framed as ongoing, a standard phrase that usually preceded an announcement of overwhelming victory. At this stage, no one in Berlin speaks of disaster. The concept simply does not exist in their mental map of the Pacific. What the staff officers do note, however, is a subtle anomaly, the absence of the expected, triumphant declaration of decisive success. Usually, Japanese communiques were swift to announce the destruction of the enemy. Today, the teletypes are strangely hesitant. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, receives the same intelligence summary shortly after Hitler. Keitel, ever the optimist and sycophant, has spent his morning reviewing logistical triumphs regarding the upcoming drive toward Stalingrad. To Keitel, the Midway report registers as merely peripheral. Germany's war, as he understands it, will be decided by tanks and infantry in the east, not by ships in an ocean he has never seen. The Pacific War remains Japan's responsibility, a convenient distraction to keep the Americans busy. Yet, even in these first hours, amidst the clatter of typewriters and the shuffling of maps, Keitel notices a deviation from the established pattern. Japanese communications are slower than usual. The claims are narrower. The usual swagger of the Imperial Navy is missing. The silence from Tokyo is not yet deafening, but it is audible to those trained to listen. It is the first quiet crack in the facade of Axis invincibility, though in the marble halls of Berlin, no one yet realizes that the tide of the entire war has just turned against them. By midday, the comfortable rhythm of the Berlin command center begins to falter. The sun is high over the Reich capital, casting long shadows through the tall windows of the Chancellery, but inside, the mood is darkening. Additional intercepts and diplomatic cables have arrived from Tokyo and neutral ports. They do not clarify the situation. Instead, they complicate it in ways that seasoned officers find deeply unsettling. One report references the loss of Japanese aircraft in significant numbers, a phrase that stands in stark contrast to the usual reports of near invulnerability. Another, more alarming cable suggests that the American carriers were not caught at anchor or surprised as they were at Pearl Harbor. Instead, the reports imply they were already at sea, positioned perfectly to launch a counterattack. This specific detail lands with the weight of a physical blow. It implies preparation. It implies that the Americans were not lucky, but informed. 4 German planners, who had spent years cultivating a sense of racial and military superiority, this is a dangerous signal. The narrative in Berlin had always been that the Americans were a mongrel nation industrially capable, perhaps, but militarily soft, undisciplined, and naive. The idea that this decadent enemy had successfully ambushed the Imperial Japanese Navy suggests a level of operational competence and intelligence penetration that German assessments had completely ruled out. Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff and a man known for his icy, unsentimental intellect, reviews the evolving intelligence with growing attention. Unlike Keitel, who often sees what he wishes to see, Jodl interprets war as a cold system of inputs and outputs. He has long argued that the United States should not be dismissed as a mere bankroll for the Allies, but treated as a serious military contender. He is sensitive to shifts in momentum, and what he reads now disturbs him. To Jodl, the absence of clear Japanese success concerns him far more than confirmed losses would have. In modern warfare, silence is rarely a sign of discipline. It is almost always a sign of damage control. When a fleet is winning, the radio traffic is boisterous, filled with coordinates of sinking enemy ships. When a fleet is dying, the airwaves go quiet as commanders struggle to save what remains. Jodl begins to request specific follow-up reports, particularly regarding the status of the Japanese carriers. He receives nothing that provides reassurance. As the afternoon progresses, internal briefings quietly adjust their language. The battle is now described as costly. American resistance is characterized as unexpectedly strong. Japanese objectives are described as contested rather than achieved. Still, no explicit admission of defeat appears. This restraint reflects a clash of military cultures that confuses the German staff. Japanese military communications are deeply influenced by a cultural need to preserve authority and face, especially in the eyes of their European allies. They cloak failure in vague politeness. German officers, trained in the Prussian tradition of blunt, often brutal operational reporting, find this opacity maddening. They understand the words, but they also understand what is missing. Within Hitler's inner circle, discussion of the Pacific remains limited. Hitler himself shows little outward reaction, maintaining his focus on the maps of Russia. He is known for compartmentalizing, for focusing entirely on immediate priorities and dismissing unfavorable news until it becomes physically unavoidable. Yet, the strategic implications are clear enough to register even in his distracted mind. If American carriers are still operational, Then the United States retains its offensive capacity. If Japan has failed to destroy them, then the American industrial base, the sleeping giant that Hitler has publicly mocked but privately feared, will have time to wake up. The Pacific theater lies far from Berlin's direct control, but the ripples from Midway are already washing against the foundations of the Third Reich's grand strategy. The assumption of a quick war, one before America could intervene, is beginning to dissolve in the static of the radio intercepts. 2 days pass. The fog of uncertainty that hung over the Reich Chancellery finally lifts on the morning of June 6th, but what it reveals is not clarity, it is catastrophe. A consolidated, high-level intelligence assessment is hand-delivered to the highest echelons of German command. The hesitation of the previous 48 hours has vanished, replaced by a stark, terrifying confirmation. The report does not use the polite euphemisms of diplomacy. It lists names: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy. The very ships that had terrorized the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean have been destroyed. They are not merely damaged. They are gone, resting at the bottom of the sea. But the report contains a detail even more chilling to the German officers reading it: the loss of personnel. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced pilots and deck crews have vanished with their ships. These were not conscripts. They were the samurai of the sky, men with thousands of flight hours who could not be replaced by factories. Adolf Hitler receives this report during a scheduled military conference. The setting is familiar: senior commanders seated around a long oak table, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension, maps of the Russian front dominating the walls. The Pacific update is delivered as a secondary agenda item, almost an afterthought to the logistics of the Eastern Front. But as the details are read aloud, the rhythmic shuffling of papers stops. The room goes silent. Hitler does not interrupt. He does not fly into one of the rages that will characterize his behavior later in the war. Instead, he listens with a cold, predatory stillness. His posture changes, shifting from bored detachment to intense focus. When he finally speaks, he does not ask about the Japanese failure. He asks about the Americans. How many carriers were involved? He demands. How quickly can they build replacements? For Hitler, the true horror of Midway is not the loss of Japanese ships. He has always privately viewed his allies with a mix of utility and condescension. The horror lies in what the battle reveals about the United States. His entire worldview has rested on a specific caricature of America, a mongrel nation, industrially powerful, but strategically slow, politically divided, and culturally incapable of waging a hard, decisive war. He believed Americans were soft, obsessed with comfort, and unable to stomach high casualties. Midway shatters that illusion in a single afternoon. The battle proves that American intelligence had penetrated the Japanese codes. It proves that American commanders could make rapid, high-stakes decisions under extreme pressure. And most dangerously, it proves that American pilots and sailors could execute coordinated, lethal strikes with a ferocity that matched the Japanese. These are not the traits of a decadent, unready opponent. These are the traits of a peer competitor. Wilhelm Keitel, standing near the Führer, observes the shift in the room's temperature immediately. The conversation awkwardly pivots away from Japan's tactical error and toward American potential. This is a direction no one wants to look. German grand strategy has always depended on one variable: time. Time to crush the Soviet Union. Time to starve Britain into submission. Time to build Fortress Europe before the Americans could mobilize their massive economy. Midway implies that time has just run out. Alfred Jodl, staring at the briefing papers, understands the industrial math better than anyone in the room. He knows that Japan has lost its offensive punch forever. Carrier warfare depends on a complex ecosystem of veteran pilots and specialized ships. Japan cannot rebuild this. The United States, by contrast, has not lost equivalent assets. Its industrial system is already expanding, glowing with the light of welding torches 24 hours a day. Hitler, sensing the gloom, reacts defensively. He waves a hand dismissively, criticizing the Japanese for unnecessary risks and arguing that the war will still be decided in Russia. The Pacific is a secondary theater, he insists. Our destiny lies in the East. But even as he speaks, the men around the table know that the strategic balance has fundamentally altered. Japan was supposed to eliminate American naval power to keep the U.S. Navy pinned down in its own coastal waters for years. Instead, the U.S. Navy is not only alive, it is victorious. The shield that was supposed to protect Germany's back has been smashed, and for the first time, the masters of the Third Reich feel the cold draft of global encirclement. As the main conference disperses, the conversation shifts from the grand theater of maps to the quiet, smoky corners where the true technicians of the war operate. Alfred Jodl returns to his office, his mind moving away from the tactical details of dive bombers and torpedoes to the grim arithmetic of attrition. Jodl has long argued that modern war is not a duel of courage, but a system of industrial output. He understands what the loss of 4 fleet carriers actually means for a nation like Japan, and by extension for Germany. To Jodl, the tragedy is not just the sinking of steel hulls. It is the incineration of human capital. Carrier warfare is an elite discipline. It requires thousands of hours to train a pilot capable of landing on a pitching deck in the middle of the ocean. When the Akagi and Kaga went down, they took a generation of naval aviators with them. Japan, with its limited fuel and rigid training doctrines, cannot replace these men. The loss is permanent. Jodl contrasts this with the reports flowing in from the United States. He opens a dossier on American industrial mobilization. The numbers are terrifying. While Japan is already scraping the bottom of its manpower reserves, the United States is only just beginning to flex its muscles. Jodl knows that shipyards in California and Virginia are operating under floodlights, 24 hours a day, unthreatened by bombers, churning out hulls at a pace that defies European comprehension. He realizes with a sinking feeling that the United States could lose a Midway-sized battle every 6 months and simply build its way out of the deficit. Japan had to win quickly or not at all. By failing at Midway, they have chosen the latter. Later that night, Karl Donitz, the commander of Germany's submarine arm, reviews the intelligence with a similar sense of foreboding. Donitz is a man obsessed with a single equation, the tonnage war. His strategy is simple. If his U-boats can sink Allied shipping faster than the Allies can build it, Britain will starve, and America will be unable to project power across the Atlantic. It is a race between the torpedo and the welding torch. For Donitz, Midway is a disaster not because of the Pacific, but because of the Atlantic. He has long regarded American shipbuilding capacity as the central problem Germany will eventually face. He had counted on the Japanese Navy to keep the United States frantic, defensive, and focused on its own survival. He needed the American Navy to be fighting for its life near Hawaii, forcing them to divert every destroyer and escort vessel to the Pacific. But Midway suggests that the American Navy is learning faster than expected. If the US retains its carriers and dominates the Pacific, its immense production capacity will not be needed to replace lost capital ships. Instead, it will be used to build what Donitz fears most, escort carriers, destroyers, and sub-hunters. Donitz stares at the charts of the Atlantic. He knows that industrial war favors the side that can absorb damage without operational collapse. Midway has proven that America possesses that capacity. The United States has taken a punch that would have crippled Italy or Japan, shook it off, and delivered a knockout blow in return. In the quiet of his quarters, Donitz admits a truth that he would never speak to his crews. The window of opportunity is closing. The assumption that Japan would dominate the Pacific indefinitely has been quietly withdrawn from the internal documents on his desk. New assessments describe the global war as dynamic. It is a polite way of saying that the initiative has been lost. The monster of American industry is fully awake, and thanks to the failure at Midway, it is now free to turn its terrible gaze toward Europe. As the shock of the initial reports fades, a profound silence settles over the German planning offices. There are no dramatic speeches in the Reichstag, no public admissions of failure, and certainly no changes to the bombastic propaganda reels playing in cinemas across Berlin. But behind the closed doors of the Bendler Block and the Wolf's Lair, a quiet, terrified reassessment has begun. For the first time since the war began, the German High Command is forced to confront a reality they had desperately tried to ignore. The war is no longer unfolding according to the script. The sequence of events they had relied upon Japan holding the Pacific while Germany crushed the Soviet Union has been broken. The assumption of uninterrupted Axis success can no longer be taken for granted. In the weeks following Midway, the internal memoranda circulating among senior planners change in tone. They do not use the language of defeat that would be treason. Instead, they use the language of delay. Timelines for victory are quietly extended. Estimates of Allied strength are revised upward. Risk, once treated as a variable to be managed, is now acknowledged as a constant condition. These documents are never read aloud to the German public. They are written in the dry, bureaucratic code of men who understand that the ground has shifted beneath their feet. The most damaging realization is not tactical, but psychological. Hitler and his inner circle had always believed that willpower and ideological fanaticism could overcome material disadvantages. They believed that the mongrel democracies were too weak-willed to fight a long, bloody war. Midway contradicts this belief in the most absolute terms possible. It demonstrates that organization, intelligence, and industrial production can reverse initial inferiority. The United States entered the war late, but it did not enter blindly. Its naval command has already learned from its defeats, adapted its tactics, and struck back with lethal efficiency. For the professional soldiers like Jodl and Keitel, this is the nightmare scenario. They realize that the United States is no longer just a potential threat on the horizon. It is an active, capable belligerent shaping the war in real time. The enemy Hitler dismissed as decadent has demonstrated clarity and resolve. The war Germany intended to conclude quickly through speed and shock the Blitzkrieg is transforming into something else entirely, a war of endurance. And endurance, more than courage or ideology, is a game of numbers. It is a game of fuel reserves, ball-bearing production, and pilot training hours. In this game, time is no longer Germany's ally. Every day that the war continues without a decisive German victory is a day the Allies grow stronger. Midway has not altered the battlefield in Europe physically. Soviet armies still stand in the east. British bombers still strike German cities at night. But the horizon has shifted. The generals begin to realize that they are no longer fighting to build a 1,000-year Reich. They are fighting to delay its collapse. This knowledge creates a strange, schizophrenic atmosphere within the command structure. Publicly, The officers must continue to radiate confidence, planning offensives and demanding sacrifices. But privately, in the margins of their notebooks and the quiet murmurs of the mess hall, they carry the burden of foresight without agency. They know the math. They know that if American carriers can survive and inflict major losses in 1942, then by 1943 and 1944, the flood of American power will be unstoppable. The war has become a trap, and Midway was the moment the jaws snapped shut. By the end of 1942, the Battle of Midway had effectively disappeared from public German discourse. It was never mentioned in the fiery speeches of Joseph Goebbels, nor did it appear in the newsreels playing before feature films in Munich or Hamburg. There were no explanations offered to the German people, no lessons publicly acknowledged. To the average citizen, the war was still a series of triumphs, interrupted only by temporary setbacks in the Russian winter. But inside the high walls of the Reich's military infrastructure, the event existed as a permanent, silent scar. For the German military leadership, Midway ceased to be a shock and became a quiet reference point, a moment fixed in memory as the first clear signal that the war's direction could no longer be reversed. Adolf Hitler continued to speak of ultimate victory with increasing fanaticism. His rhetoric grew more absolute, demanding loyalty and sacrifice as the strategic situation deteriorated. Yet, his decisions began to reflect constraint rather than confidence. He refused withdrawals, denied requests for flexibility, and insisted on holding every inch of ground regardless of the cost. This rigidity was not the posture of a leader expanding his empire. It was the desperate grip of a man attempting to deny the loss of control. Within the senior officer corps, the knowledge acquired in that summer of 1942 deepened into a grim resignation. Alfred Jodl continued to plan operations with professional rigor, but his assessments now assumed a prolonged conflict against materially superior enemies. The language of possibility had been replaced by the language of management. The war was no longer framed as something to be won quickly, but as a disaster to be endured for as long as possible. Wilhelm Keitel, bound closely to Hitler, suppressed his doubts and enforced obedience, understanding that the system he served depended on discipline, not dissent. Silence became a form of survival. Karl Donitz continued his submarine campaign in the Atlantic with ruthless determination, but he watched the math turn against him. As American shipyards poured out new vessels and escort carriers closed the air gaps in the ocean, the imbalance identified after Midway matured into total dominance. He pressed forward not because he believed victory was still achievable, but because the machinery of the state demanded action until it collapsed. Midway's place in this story is not dramatic in the way Stalingrad or D-Day were. No German cities burned because of it. No Wehrmacht armies surrendered in its aftermath. Its power lay in what it revealed early to those trained to see patterns rather than headlines. It exposed the fundamental imbalance at the heart of the conflict, an imbalance that ideology could not correct and courage could not offset. When the war finally ended in the ruins of Berlin in 1945, the outcome shocked the civilians emerging from the cellars. But it did not shock the men who had studied the numbers 3 years earlier. For them, the conclusion had been visible since the moment American carriers survived and struck back in the Pacific. Midway did not end the war, but it clarified it. It proved that modern war is decided not by belief or declaration, but by capacity, adaptation, and time.